Welcome to Thought Exchange, where ideas are currency. I am your host, Nigel Fox, and today I've interviewed Jacob Hester-Heard, a good friend of mine, a writer, guitarist, creative, among other things. Today we dove into stories and their place in our culture, their meaning and their impact, morality and law and the conflict between the two, and much, much more. It was a fascinating conversation, and I hope you enjoy. Jacob, welcome. Welcome to Thought Exchange. I'm happy to have you here.
Nigel, thank you for having me. I'm excited to exchange my thoughts with your thoughts.
I'm excited to hear them. I'm excited for the conversation. Right off the bat, I wanted to ask you, what do you think the stories that we tell indicate about the culture we live in? And I use the royal we as in people in general.
Yeah. That's a pretty universal question because it depends on what culture you're in, when that culture is taking place, and a whole lot of other factors. But it is a pretty universal answer as well. I think all cultures tell stories, and the stories that those cultures tell really say more about those cultures than maybe anything else. Even the archaeological record, if you're going way back, one of the best indicators of where that culture is where that culture understands itself to be within the narrative. The best place to look is the stories that they tell about themselves, about those around them, who they consider the others to be, and why, and who they consider to be insular to that culture. So, yeah, the stories that we tell ourselves, broadly speaking, I would say that communicates more Platonic reality, right? Reality that's outside of even our understanding, but in a sense more realistic than anything else that we experience day to day. Our stories get to the root of that matter more quickly than anything else.
Now, when you say outside, do you mean like an objective perspective, or just a perspective that's, I guess, universal to that specific society?
Well, so Plato would say that there exists truth beyond anything that we're able to attain in this reality, and that anything that we do here is basically an approximation of that truth. And we can get really close, and we can know what we're talking about, right? We can know what a square is. We can know what a circle is. We can describe these Platonic solids, if you will, by very real means. But at the end of the day, we're still circumscribing the actual truth that exists beyond. And I think that's importantly one of the roles that stories play, is they help us approximate that truth, that higher truth that exists beyond anything that we could ever experience or imagine, but we know is there somewhere. Our stories give us a unique ability to get as close to that truth as we ever can, because we know it's out there, and we know the best we can do is approximate it. And the way that we approximate that truth is through storytelling. Whether it is day to day, and you're telling your coworker how your weekend was, and you skip over a couple of details that don't matter. Why don't they matter? You emphasize some details that do matter to the story of how your weekend went, because in the context of telling your coworker how that weekend was, you are giving them the story of how your weekend was, not the play-by-play, not what actually happened, but what was meaningful to you and what you understand to be meaningful to your audience. A communications major would say that the message has to be, first of all, you have to think of what you're going to say, right? But it has to be encoded, it has to be transmitted, it has to be decoded, and it has to be received. And through that process, you're inherently changing what and how you say based on the audience you're speaking to, based on the medium you're using to make that communication. And a storyteller would describe that process in a very similar way, because all of those things matter to the story. You're going to describe how your weekend went to one coworker a completely different way than you will to another, because it's the story, it's the truth you're approximating via the dirty, difficult, incomplete, imperfect mechanisms of even just language that I'm struggling to use even to communicate with you now. It's not perfect, but I'm describing something that is perfect. It is real. It is the only thing that's real. It is the truth. And so anything that I tell you has to be an approximation of that truth. And I think that's where stories come in.
I think that's a pretty interesting perspective and take. And I want to push the analogy a bit farther, because it kind of sounds like, the events that happen in our regular day it's almost like data, right? It's just a bunch of things that happened, and stories are concentrating that into what you said, the meaningful parts, at least in our context. And that's kind of interesting because, you would tell your story about your day differently depending on who you talk to, right? Because it's all about the context, right? The way you would tell your day to your mom versus your coworker versus, your kid are going to be completely different, because what's meaningful is separate from the truth, like what actually happened.
It's separate from what is.
I want to pivot a little bit to the media that we consume as let's just stick with the West, America. So like the TV that we watch, the videos that we watch, the social media that we use, because even though they're all different formats, they're still avenues of storytelling. So I'm curious what you think, what our current consumption of media and stories is saying about us.
Well, man, this question in particular, I think I'm going to answer probably a little bit more biased than what I tried to get to with the previous question, because I'm coming at it from a perspective where our culture is aware of a problem, but unaware of the solution. And one of the solutions that we've approximated is filling in a gap with these other stories. I think that as a society, without getting on my soapbox too much, we're more distant than we have been in the past, and we're more distant from each other than we know to be the healthiest equilibrium that we could be in. If you look at the distant past, or even if you just look at the trend as you go backwards in time, both would indicate that our societies were structured more around community than they have been towards modernity or towards whatever direction we're headed. And I think that stories help fill a gap that we're very aware of subconsciously, and we attempt to solve that gap through what may be subconscious desires, such as, literally, when you go on some social medias and you try to see what your friends are up to, the platform of social media that's hosting that person's day-to-day or whatever they felt was important to share with whoever, a lot of platforms call that their story, okay? I don't think that's a coincidence. I think we're, to some very deep level, we are still aware of this gap that we are not okay with, because we are very social creatures. For almost all of human existence, we've lived in, compared to metropolitan cities of today, villages, essentially. Even the biggest cities, you knew everyone on your block, and you worked together on whatever. The apartment I'm in right now, I couldn't tell you the names of any of my neighbors, and I don't like that. I would love to do something about that, but I don't know what time they get home from work. I don't know what their day-to-day is, and if they can take on any more responsibilities or any more relationships. And so I don't want to bother them. And in a lot of ways, I can't bother them with my friendship or whatever. And so I fill that gap through other means. And I've gotten off social media completely in the last couple of years because at some point I realized that it wasn't actually making any more meaning in my life. The connections I was making were not meaningful, and the actions that I was taking with those connections were not meaningful. So I pursued other meaning in other places, other stories with other people who were real, or a closer approximation of real than social media. Again, this is all an example, but I think that it is a good indicator of where we are as a society currently, where we know we want to be, and the steps that we're trying to take to get there. And I think it's healthy to have this discourse and to try to find a closer approximation of that truth. And honestly, I don't know what it is. I don't know how we bridge that gap and how we get closer to our real communities, whether they're communities of distance and convenience, like my apartment, or whether they're communities of similar minds coming together for joint ventures, such as you and I are partaking in right now. And I would love to hear your thoughts, impromptu as they may be, on this particular issue, because I don't know how to fit in this gap of real societal loneliness that I think many of us feel in the stories that we tell each other day to day.
I think that you're definitely onto something, and I like the way that you brought up the point about social media's stories, right? Whatever's on the front page is their story. I think that's a great point. I never really thought about it before. And I think the loneliness epidemic, I mean, it definitely has a large relationship with social media. And I think a big part of that is the story that we tell ourselves on social media, right? You see people's highlights. Yeah. You see the highlights of their lives, and it creates a story. It creates a tale, essentially, of, oh, I went to Cabo, and then I went to Dubai, and then I went to the south of Spain. Mm-hmm. And I was actually just talking with a friend recently about this, and they were like, yeah, but they don't post their bank statement after those trips. They don't post them getting back to their normal life and being like, wow, that was exhausting, all that travel, or just a vapid expense, you know what I mean, to post on social media.
Yeah.
And I've definitely heard that experience before, where, not specific to social media, but just being so focused in not the moment, trying to capture something, whether it's through social media or just being nervous maybe in a different context, where you don't even remember you were there. Like you're only The only evidence that you had were there are those pictures because you didn't take any time to take deep breaths and enjoy the spaces you were in.
Right.
And I think that people compare their normal lives, which I mentioned earlier, it's just data. It's just a bunch of things that happened, right? And on any given day, like, sure, there's a string of events that are related because you go to work and work-related things happen. You come home, home-related things happen, but it's not exactly the same as a story.
Right.
And when you're on social media, you get a curated experience. Life is not a curated experience. You know, you can do lifestyle design and choose somewhat the things you want to do on a daily basis. But in comparison to, you know, what's filmed for you to consume, it doesn't even come close to comparing. And, you know, the comparison is the thief of joy, right? We're gonna sit here with our normal lives, or maybe even above I mean compared to the world, of much above
Amazing.
average lives, and be like, well, I don't have a
I'm
Lamborghini,
depressed.
and it looks like all these 17-year-olds have Lamborghinis.
Right.
So
Little do you know, they're renting them for a day to promote this lifestyle that is unattainable for them, but to create the curated content that their followers, or who they think will be their followers, if it's on speculation, you're only going to see, like you said, this curated aspect of reality, which is ironically the opposite of an approximation of the truth. In fact, it's actually an act of deception. And sadly, what that's going to create in you, and this is really the main reason I got off social media, it's going to cause you to go, I need to create and curate my story for the people in this virtual community, right? Because in a real sense, it is a community, but in the realist sense, it is not a real community. It is a community of lies for us and by us. And that's the part that I said, you know, I don't want to participate in this. It's not a holier than thou. I've got better stuff to do. I'm doing so great that I don't want to come down to your level and share with you. It was a recognition that this wasn't healthy for me or for others, and I just didn't want to participate in that process. Because it is driven by the right things, a desire to fit in, a desire to have community and culture, and to share with others those things. But it is going about it in exactly the wrong way, in a way that actually destroys those things. Now, that's my opinion. I could be wrong about some of those facts.
it's your thought.
That's my thought, and you know, I'm just here to exchange it with you. But I feel very strongly about that. Like I said, this was several years ago, and I would say I'm glad that I took that step. And I would also say simultaneously that a lot of people might not be ready for it, because my personal experience has been that it's a lot harder to, without that resource, without that tool, which it can be a very positive tool if you use it as such, it's more difficult to make some connections, right? When somebody says, back in the early 2000s, you know, are you on email? That sounds dated now. Today it might be, what's your Insta? I don't have an Instagram to share with somebody. I basically have a phone number, and that's kind of all I have to offer. And to a complete stranger, they might not be willing to share their phone number, and that's fair. So it is more difficult. But I maintain that it's worth it, because when I do breach that difficulty, what I find invariably is that the connection is much stronger. It will last. The content, no pun intended, but the content of that relationship is unlike the curated content of a social media alternative. It is real, and it is raw, and it's difficult, and sometimes painful, and sometimes regrettable, but at the end of the day, those who filter through that difficulty end up being some of the closest relationships that I can call friends and loved ones in my entire life, by comparison to the alternative of social media and vapid culture.
Yeah, there really ought to be a social media that is just oh, I was going to say just phone numbers, but that's phone numbers. But you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Something that's not quite as sensitive, because, I mean, no one wants to change their number after having it for years. But, like, you get on there, and it's just a way to contact people. There's no pictures. There's no bullshit. It's just, oh, I want a low-stakes way to be able to interact with you again. You know what I mean? I think maybe there's a niche there. Maybe we should... maybe we have another project.
But that's what things like Facebook and MySpace were originally intended to be. It was, if this goes south, I can just ignore them or delete my account or change my account or block them. There's all these mechanisms that a higher level application such that a login provides you, right? Gives you when you're moving past the, let's say, the infrastructure level of a phone number, right? And that's great. And the intent, I think, was there all along, to be a profile, and it's a picture of you, and it's what you like and your hobbies, and it's a great representation of you. But very quickly, people realized, and this is not to denigrate any particular person, I think to a degree we all did it. We decided, I'm actually going to present my best self. I'm going to put my best foot forward. That's the advice my mom gave me before the big job interview. Why not? And that's a really fair point, because that's exactly what we do in day-to-day life with a new acquaintance that we just met. We're not going to be jerks. We're not going to be completely ourselves. But the difference is the stories that we're telling that person over coffee, face-to-face, they are a closer approximation of the truth of who you actually are than the selfie that you took 20 times to find the perfect angle and lighting to upload to your story. Because there's no editor. There's no curation in media res in real time with that person they're sitting in front of. You and I right now, we are being way closer to who we are than if we took this take by take, reading off of a script, and decided, we're only going to present the version of this conversation that we wanted 2 weeks ago when we wrote it. It's realer, it's more human. Oddly enough, it's actually what our brains like more, because we know it's real. And when we go, I liked that person, we know that we really liked them and not something that I can't even put my finger on. I don't even know what to call it besides, I don't know, it's not real. And I think it's important that those are the stories that we prioritize are the ones that are the closest approximations of the truth, whether it's about who we are, whether it's about what we enjoy, what we're looking for. If you go dating these days, and there's plenty of dating apps, and that's great, I would encourage you to go on a first date as soon as possible and just talk to them about what's important to you and ask them what's important to them. I guarantee you're going to have a better experience going about it that way than you are pretending to be someone who you're not, ideally having them fall in love with whoever that person is, and then ideally having the rug pulled out from under the both of you when that all comes crashing down. Because I'm telling you, brother, you do not want to live the rest of your life under that lie. It has to be miserable. And I think we've all done it to a degree in the past.
I want to refocus
Sure.
back to the story aspect a little bit.
Fair.
But no, I think that was really insightful. So I've been thinking about the types of like TV shows that are popular and stuff like that. And maybe it's a bit of extrapolation into their beyond what their real influence or meaning is, but Shows that have no consequence are pretty common nowadays.
Sure.
And when I say that, I mean shows like South Park or Family Guy or, these sitcoms where at the beginning of the next episode, nothing in the previous episode really mattered.
Right.
Does that make sense? And it just kind of made me reflect on how that impacts people because, we've been watching these shows for decades. Kids grow up on them. I grow up on them. And it kind of makes me think that it must have some relation to the aversion to responsibility that I feel that a lot of people nowadays have. People are growing up older or slower, if that makes sense. So, people are living at home longer. Of course, there's economic reasons for that, but it's not just the aspect of living at home. It's taking on the full responsibility of being an adult and dealing with the fact that the world isn't the way you want it to be. And attempting to get away with things that I think previously are a bit like moral brick walls. Like, you just don't do that. You know what I mean? Because I feel like a lot of the stories, a lot of the media that we consume, video games, GTA 5, stuff like that, like there's no moral. You do whatever you want, or in the TV show, they do whatever they want. There are no consequences at the end of the day. And, they wake up the next morning or the next episode comes on and it's like none of that even happened. So I'm curious if you see something similar to what I see there in this.
Yeah. I can't remember if it was Plato or Socrates or some other philosopher off the top of my head. Yeah, Socrates. Thank you for correcting me. But one of the major thinkers that Western society is largely founded upon truly believed, and I really hope it's Plato because that would be very ironic considering what I'm about to say, said that the music of the day was a corrupting factor in the youth. I would say that what you're identifying absolutely is happening. And I would argue that it is more of a sign of the times rather than a causal factor to a degree, because I can see both happening at the same time, right? They're not incompatible.
A feedback loop of sorts.
Absolutely. But I would say that, and this is, I've laid it on the table. This is my bias. This is the framework that I'm understanding the world through. This is the story I'm telling myself. I understand the world to be more so a structure of people are dissatisfied with where they are in life, and they're trying to find ways to solve that, very broadly speaking. And one of the areas that we're discussing in the context of this particular issue is that, let's say the youth, or for whatever reason, the disenfranchised of society, or the not yet enfranchised, the troublemakers, whether they're punk kids at the mall, or they're just, 12-year-olds who they don't know how to behave right yet, or they're school shooters who they've got nothing left in their mind, in their story that they're telling themselves. So they decide to do whatever it is. Act up while their mom is at the store. Or whatever it is. They believe, truly, from their perspective, consistent with the story, that they understand themselves to be playing a role in. I'll put it this way. Nobody thinks that they're the villain. Everyone thinks they're the main character, to one degree or another. It's the reason why when you're making a show for primetime, you make the main character relatable. because you want to participate in that cultural zeitgeist, and you want people who watch it to go, yeah, I get that. I understand why he's doing or she's doing what they are. When you say shows like South Park, Family Guy, may be causing this phenomenon of no consequences, I can see that to an extent, but I don't know. I'm not quite convinced yet, and I'm still working out what I would more definitively say I believe the cause of that phenomenon to be. So I'm not quite ready to give what...
I will chime in real quick.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that they're necessarily causing it. What I'm really saying is there's definitely, at least in my eyes, a relationship there.
Sure.
There might be some causal relationship in both directions. Mm-hmm. I don't think that those shows are bad or evil or anything like that. Sure. I just think that everything you consume, everything you absorb has an impact on you and the way that you view the world and the way that you view yourself in the world. And especially if you consume it for, years and years and years, that is literally what culture is. It's a part of our culture, and our culture dictates who we are. That's why people are creatures of their time,
Yeah, I would completely agree with what you've said and how you've said it. That's why I'm trying to take a very neutral approach on this. Like I said, I haven't figured out what I believe some of the root causes to be. Going to my previous argument of society and the drift away from, let's say, localization of society and culture and community, maybe I would argue that there not being consequences has to do to a degree with our drift away from that society, right? If I go home and the only person I have to answer to is mom, that's not very high stakes compared to I have to explain myself, and I have to do that to every single person in a 1 mile radius. That is a lot harder to do consistently if it is not the truth, if it's not completely integrated with the approximation of reality that our stories tell. So when you deviate from that, there are real consequences when you're fully integrated into that society, and there are a lot fewer consequences when you're not. And I think that's one of the outcroppings that we see when a society becomes a little bit more fractured, because we're not sharing this cultural context. We're not sharing this story that is our culture with each other nearly as intimately as we want to. Yeah, we want that very, very badly. If I said you could live your life exactly the way it is, but you'd be a lot closer with every single person you ran into, I don't think anyone would turn that down that's in a relatively healthy place already. And I think that's one of the issues we're facing right now is our society, our culture, and the stories that we understand and tell each other they're not one, they're not unified. They are disintegrated in a literal and in a metaphorical sense.
I think how I would describe what you were just talking about is really shame. At least that's a large aspect of it.
Sure.
When you come home and mom disapproves of what you did versus the community disapproves of what you did. And I've definitely heard, modern or takes on modern society as being shameless. People don't really have shame. And, people view it in different ways, positive or negative. I think that there is healthy shame. I think that there is something positive that comes to the individual and the culture, the society, when people don't feel good about doing things that are bad, You know what I mean? Or don't feel good about doing things that are
Yeah.
extremely self-interested.
Absolutely.
I definitely agree with your point there.
Yeah.
That shame can be a good thing, right? Having the social limitation on your actions so that you don't do things that are reprehensible and feel like you can get away with them or feel like they're not wrong because there's not enough of a social pressure to make you feel bad about what you did. Because shame is a lot stronger than many of the other emotions that we feel, and any pressures. People fucking seppuku was to remove shame, and you cut your stomach open and just waited to die unless they chopped your head off.
Look, as Gordon Gekko said, greed is good. This incredibly negative value that we tell ourselves is a negative force. It has a place in society as a force of good in certain contexts. And shame, guilt, I would say is the other mechanism for this phenomena. They can be good things. They can be incredibly beneficial to society and to culture and to the greater story. In a lot more in Eastern cultures, I would say shame is a social pressure to prevent negative behavior, and a lot more in Western cultures, and there's overlap, of course. I would say that guilt is more so the mechanism that we use, and I'm sure a lot of our listeners can identify with this one a little bit more than shame, assuming that they come from westernized civilizations. Insofar as guilt as a mechanism comes usually after the act, and it in some cases can be too little too late, but it fulfills the same purpose in a very individual sense that a shame from the cultural pressure can, right? If I'm not making enough money to support my family, I'd feel very guilty about that, and I'd feel ashamed as well. And both of those pressures are going to cause me to change my behaviors in so far as I'm able, because we all have bounds that we have to operate within in reality. But yeah, shame and guilt, as negative as those things can be, they're negative for a positive benefit to society. And this conversation has gotten a lot more societal than it has purely stories, but I think that's because society is where our day-to-day stories collide with our realities. It's where the rubber meets the road, if you will. It's the canvas on which our stories play out. So it's the one that is inherently most meaningful, most applicable, and the easiest to resonate at the individual level.
When you think of your favorite books or your favorite TV shows, as you mentioned earlier, you probably identify pretty heavily with one of the characters. And I think a unique aspect of stories is getting to really try on someone else's shoes and try on someone else's beliefs, try on their moral system, their ethic system.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that stories are really powerful in that way, right? Because when you're reading a book, you might encounter situations that you haven't in real life, or you may never in real life, or maybe you have before, and it gives you a different perspective on how you would deal with that situations. And I think back to what we were saying earlier, the kind of vapid nature of a lot of media and social media, it's not just that it's not really full of meaning, it's that it's taking up place of things that used to be filled with meaning. And because we lack we're now lacking for those things, whether it be real relationships or stories with morals or parables or something like that. I feel like people don't get to develop their morals as much anymore, and I feel that culturally, at least in the U.S., I feel like we are less moral than we used to be. People have their lines, and where they're willing to cross them is a lot more blurred than in the past. Of course, that doesn't mean that there weren't people who went too far before, but if you don't exercise that muscle of what would I do in this situation, and I, books and stories do that, you know what I mean? They get you invested in a character, so it's not like it's just a thought experiment, or it's like, oh, what would I do in this situation? It's like, oh, I care about this character, and I care about this character's relationship with another. What would I have done in that situation? And it's kind of like a muscle, or it's kind of like a workout for your empathic and morals. You know what I mean? In the sense that if you're on social media, you don't have a ton of friends, which is most people. People have less friends than ever before. People are more lonely than ever before. People go out less than ever before. So you're not really building this compass in how you would want to interact with other people. You're not really getting those reps in. And another one of those places where you get reps in is stories.
Absolutely. I mean, as soon as you said you get to try on their shoes, walk a mile in their shoes, I mean, I'm thinking immediately of the role that dreams play. I mean, in a sense, they're defragmenting the hard drive of your brain and its experiences throughout the day. And in another sense, they're giving you an opportunity to try things in a completely risk-free environment that your subconscious deems important to try out. And that is built into us from the factory. And it should be no surprise to us that we take that internal reality, and our external experience reflects that to some degree. In the stories that we consume, they don't just shape us, but they are a process in and of themselves. I mean, after the advent of shows like The Sopranos, we saw the anti-hero come into the scene to critical acclaim for, I hesitate to say the first time in a long time, but it was a powerful movement where we could empathize with these horrible people to a degree we were completely unable to in the past. And you can say that's a positive or a negative influence to society, but I would argue that a healthy person participating in that process is going to get something deeply profound and positive. And I would say that maybe the degradation of that process that you alluded to earlier has a little to do with the fact that those stories we're consuming have become more vapid and meaningless. If it's social media, maybe that's the most recent iteration. Or if it's serialized TV shows, or, even worse, the TV shows that are self-contained and the next episode, basically nothing that happened before happened again. And that's very useful for a product that you want to put out there and have consequence-free, dream-like control over, because it all just resets next episode anyway. Or whether that's movies, which were a step down from, before movies. Kind of the only thing that there was, I don't know, maybe plays, or probably the best approximation, books. People don't read books like they did 500 years ago. Obviously. The people who could read, they were reading. even 200-300 years ago. The people who could read, especially during the Enlightenment, holy cow, they were reading. That's all there was to do. That was entertainment for the most part. If you weren't going out with friends or playing a sport or something like that, you weren't able to watch TV. If you had a desire to watch TV 200 years ago, you were reading a book. And you can very, very deeply understand the story of the characters therein to a degree that I don't think we participate in nearly as much today. Being able to participate in that dreamlike, consequence-free environment of empathizing or sympathizing with a ton of very well fleshed out notional people, if we're talking about a work of fiction, or a very, very real approximation of real people in a work of nonfiction, is a process that let us make their mistakes and not have to suffer the consequences and learn as a result.
That's a great way to put it. And your example of Sopranos reminds me of, well, just it highlights the idea of needing stories to really make the point hit home, in the sense that, yes, you have anti-heroes that, a normal, healthy, productive member of society will still root for.
Yeah.
The moral question of, is it okay for the poor man to steal bread for his family, right? That is a thought experiment, is bland, and it's not interactive. It's barely even an exercise, because everyone's just going to come into their thing with the things that have already influenced them and just say one or the other. When you have sat down, and I don't know how many seasons the Sopranos had, but you watch season after season of this show and you're invested in the characters, or you read hundreds or thousands of pages of a book and you're invested in these characters, and then that question comes up, this character might die if this other character doesn't steal the bread. That's much closer to an approximation of real life, as you were talking about, than kind of what I would describe as the vapid version of that. The 2 cents, the TikTok version. Oh, would you let a person steal your bread if they had to fill their family's stomachs?
No, obviously not, because whatever. The question, would you steal bread to feed your family, is a really easy question to answer before you've heard the story. And it's until you experience a story like Jean Valjean's in Les Miserables that question becomes emotionally driven and a lot more nuanced and a lot more complicated. And it involves inherently the characters and their motivations and their lives. And these are not real people, but they become real. Their stories manifest into reality within the soul of the person who experiences them secondhand. And the question of whether I would steal bread and become prisoner 24601 and experience hell in the system that demonizes a crime, regardless of its context, that becomes maybe a different answer than you started with. And that story changes you in a incredibly real sense, even though it's a work of fiction, ultimately. Is not just playgrounds where you can throw around the idea and not risk anything. It changes who you are. And that's an important process.
Yeah, it's an important process of growth. And I think that because people don't do that as much anymore, there's a bit of stagnation in that way. And people can only see, they don't have as broad of a perspective as they could have. Now, I don't know if people had broader perspectives in the past. I'm sure in some ways they did, in some ways they didn't. But with the almost unlimited access to information and stories, for the result to be, almost like overload and regression after access to all these positive things, is unfortunate. And I think that one of the big results of that in the moral space, in the changes we see and how people view their own morals and their place in society, comes from the law. And I'm gonna change the topic a little bit here, but like, if you're not religious, which I personally am not, then you have a lot of work to do to come up with a moral, foundation, because there's not a book or a scripture or oral history. You know what I mean? You have to, of course you can pull from all of these things, but because it's not, at least personally, not faith-based, it's a lot of, finding out what each of these things means to you as an individual. And because, a lot of people, even people who are religious nowadays, are not as, devout, I guess I would say, like that, they don't practice as fervently as people have in the past. They don't quite buy in as much. And I think that it results in people replacing their moral system with the law. And it's interesting because, you'll, just because something is illegal doesn't mean it's bad, and I think most people know that.
Yeah.
And vice versa. Like, there are plenty of things that are illegal that you'd be like, well, should that be illegal? And there are plenty of things that aren't illegal where it's like, that guy should be in prison. You know what I mean? And I think it has to create some kind of confusion. I find it confusing when the law doesn't line up with when the law is what you're basing your morality off of, because that's the written doctrine, that's what's enforced. There's not a separate moral standard that's enforced from some spiritual sense. It's just the law, and there's no shame, so there's no societal pressure either, and it's just the law. And then you get to the point where people confuse the law for being right and wrong, which is, on its surface, doesn't sound bad, but really the law is written to be general so that people with morals outside of the law, judges, can adjudicate on cases. But if your only understanding is the law, then the nuance that goes into deeming whether something is right or wrong, or deeming whether a punishment is too severe or not, it gets lost, because you're supposed to be battling these two things. You know what I mean? The law and morality are they're not on opposite sides, but they do compete in a way that ideally leaves the individuals in a place that benefits everyone.
Yeah. Morality, I think, in the context of this conversation, would occupy the highest truth that we're trying to approximate. And one of the mechanisms that we do to get closer to that reality would be the law. And it's necessarily too little too late. Just like a guilt-based society compared to another solution, which would be a shame-based society, I would say that law fits more neatly into the category of guilt. When we convict somebody, we say they're guilty of that crime. Whereas a shame-based culture is trying to prevent that from the start. And that's a really nuanced thing to try to tell somebody. It's not just don't kill somebody, because it's really easy to say. But the problem arises when that's not enough. And what do you do about that? And in a shame-based culture, you might tell a story. You might say, well, the reason you can't kill somebody is because they're just like you, and that's not fair. And that's a very nascent, juvenile way to start that conversation. But it is an example of a shame-based approach. It's actually kind of a fusion of the two, because I said the word fair, and that's more of a guilt-based approach, because that's the society I was raised in. This is very natural for me. I am a lot more attuned to faith and religion now over the last 5 or 6 years than I was raised in a very, this is science and this is the way things are and this is what's right and wrong and fair and just follow the rules and you'll do great. And at some point I found God, and that's been invaded by these stories of, okay, but here's why. Because I had the physics of how the world worked, but I didn't have the metaphysics of why it works that way. And I think that's the function in this morality being the story we're trying to approximate our reality to. The law gets us there from one direction, and faith, that's a loaded minimization of a huge thing we're talking about. It gets you there from the other direction, right? We could say law, society, the force mechanism of other people in your village or tribe, right? Whereas there's a completely external pressure coming from the other direction of your faith, your religion, where you fit into the world and eschatology in the world beyond, that's coming from a power that's even higher than your peers or judges. I mean, it's beyond all of that. It's God or the universe, whatever you subscribe to. And I think we're both of those sides. I think it's healthy to be in balance with both of them, because they're both looking at, let's say, the same mountain from two different perspectives. I've personally experienced something on that journey of the past 5 or 6 years, right? That maybe this is what caused the journey, or maybe it was a fruit of that journey. Not sure which, but I believe that if you get to know somebody so well that you know everything about them, and I mean everything. Essentially, they're your best friend, right? You know everything they've done, every reason they did it, every misstep in their lives, and all of the context that vindicates that. Because, they messed up, but I get it. Because if it was me, I would have done the exact same thing. I think once you get to know somebody that well, you kind of can't help but be best friends with them or love them in that filio, brotherly love at the very least. Because once you know their story that intimately, you've just participated in the thing that the best TV show you ever saw made you do with the main character, who, by the way, is an anti-hero and deplorable, but you'll like him anyway because you get him. And that happens every day with the people around you. It's a little scary to admit that, but I think once you get to know somebody that well, even if they were a complete stranger a month prior, nothing special has to happen to your relationship for this phenomenon to take place. If you get to know them that well, they are going to be a very profound person in your life, and you will not be able to help but love them in some real way, just as a result of getting to know their story. It's kind of unsettling, honestly, if you think about it. Right?
No, I mean, it's the thing that is difficult about, I think, the law, like passing judgment on someone. And that's why judges are supposed to be impartial, because if you get to know someone, you can't really get to know someone and condemn them at the same time, I feel. Unless they're completely different than you, unless there's some block where you can't empathize with them, you know, maybe they're a psychopath or something, I don't know, but or maybe you're just been raised so differently for so long. But no, I mean, what you said is very profound, and I think that in a sense the law is, you know, morality is what's right and wrong, right? The law is almost, but that's always extremely nuanced and has to take in the entire context of everything ever. And the law is really just, these are the things that we don't know about. Please don't do them so we don't have to answer that question, right? Please don't don't do heroin because we don't know if that's right or wrong or if we should punish you or help you. Please don't you know, murder someone who assaulted you because we might have to give you the death penalty. Like, that's the point of the law. It's to prevent people from making... Go ahead.
These are the things as a society we are very uncomfortable with. So don't you dare confront us with them. We're not ready to go there yet. We haven't figured them out. We don't know where that fits in our story as a culture. We know that we don't like them. And if it's bad enough, it's kind of your fault if you bring it to our attention. Okay? Fair? Can we all agree to that? That's kind of the place that law takes. Religion, those it's a loaded thing, but the things that are coming from the other direction that are, let's just generalize them and say that they're more shame-based than guilt-based. Those are the things more so that we are certain about. And there is overlap. Murder, right? That fits very neatly in both camps. And for two different reasons, we're very capable of saying there are exact instances where murder is wrong, period. But there's also instances where we're really uncomfortable with the question. So just don't make us answer it, okay?
We don't have to go into examples, but I mean, we're both soldiers, literally trained to kill people for the right reasons,
killers,
culturally,
baby.
Right?
For the right reasons. How insane is that?
I think. Have you ever seen? You know who Mr. Beast is?
Who's that? Oh, is that the guy with 300 million subscribers or whatever? Yeah, I don't follow him, but
he gave me
yes,
$300 million
I know exactly.
the other day.
Oh, sick. Yeah, same.
Yeah. I saw this tweet by him. It was over a year ago, and I'm not on Twitter, so I don't know how I saw this tweet. It probably popped up on something else.
Sure.
But it was, would you take $10,000, but someone random on Earth dies? And I won't tell you the results, but I think the results, if you took them 100 years ago or 50 years ago or 300 years ago, I think they would be different. And I also just think it's so profound. I mean, how do you think it was answered? And I'll go into it more after.
Oh, I think that far too many people said, yeah, absolutely. And I think the reason for that is our society is so fractured and separate, and the world is such a big place. And I'm not from that country, and I don't know those people. And I know they're there, which is ironically part of the problem. I know they're there, but I'm not them. That combined with, well, people die every day, and I need $10,000 today. I think a lot of people probably said yes. And I think what you're getting at, 50, 100, whatever time frame, we're talking about a calculus kind of driven, the trend as you approach the past. It seems like it would probably approach more of a no, because our world was, in a sense, smaller. We didn't know that people were over there nearly as much as we do today. And the people we did know were a much bigger part of our lives. And so the thought of someone essentially from that random pool dying was a lot more painful to us and unacceptable. So that's my assumption. I would be interested to hear whether that's close or not.
Yeah, I mean, your assumption is the same as my assumption. I think the results were 45% of people would take it, 55 wouldn't, which is insane. I honestly, when I first read the question, I thought more people would take it, but it is just kind of crazy to think about because I think there's two levels of it. There's one of them is this right or is this wrong? I think it's wrong. Obviously, a human life is worth more than $10,000. I think the other part of it is I'm probably not going to know who it is, so why should I care?
Right.
You know, like, and that's at the pinnacle of the argument. That's at the crux of the argument, right? Because if they did know who they are, there's no way you would do it. But it's the same thing, right? Just because you don't know them doesn't change the fact that other people know them. Someone is that person, and many people know that person. And I think that kind of justification, in a sense, like, oh, people that I know matter, people that I don't know don't matter.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's also hard to avoid it in this day and age because of how many people there are, and
to a degree you have to prioritize. But
yeah,
where do you draw the line? I guess.
Yeah, but I thought that was pretty fascinating because it's less than 50%, but almost 50% for $10,000. Like, that's, you know what I mean? In the past, you could keep the amount of money the same, and it'd be worth more, and still, I believe less people would do it. And not just for like, oh, I don't know them, or it's less likely to be, or it's more likely to be someone I know. It's just also, as we talked earlier, like, I think people were more principled. You know what I mean? They, at least in the West, they sacrificed more for the greater good, or the good of society, the good of the family, and you might think that I'm being negative or maybe romanticizing the past, but I mean, most people would say that our culture has become more individualistic over time. The opposite of that is being more communal, and if you're willing to put the community first, you're not willing to personally take $10,000 for random people to die.
Yeah, and I'm glad you caveated that within the West, because all this entire conversation, right? There's a huge asterisk that this is the culture that we're familiar with, and so there's a huge assumption that, like, we don't know what the hell we're talking about in the cultures we weren't raised in. But I would agree that the culture we are familiar with is probably more than we are, even the people within that culture, comfortable with, is more fragmented, more divided. And we're not even talking about politics. A good friend of mine and I were talking just today about the fact that we're kind of lonely compared to where we think we would be just a couple of generations ago, because we wanted more meaningful connections, the same amount of connections we were comfortable with, but more meaningful connections with those we did interact with on a daily basis, right? Even if it's just your grocer, right? There was a time where you went to the same pharmacy because there was like two in town and this one was closer, and you knew that pharmacist really well. And I don't think in that context you're going to find nearly as many people essentially dehumanizing even a hypothetical person somewhere in the world and saying, yes, I can ascribe a specific value to that life, and it's this amount, and yes, I would take it over that life. There are a lot of other factors that play into that kind of decision that are way more complicated than we can get into today. But I think culture, the stories that drive that culture and the way we interpret it, because it's both ways, have driven that question to be answered a little bit more problematically than we would like it to be, even as people, not just you and I, even to the people who are answering that question problematically, right? They're probably not that comfortable with their answer either.
So I think the takeaway is read more books, right?
Yeah, that's right. Speaking of, aren't you? This is not a plug, but you're writing a book right now, right?
I am writing a book. I've heard that you're writing a book.
Yeah. I think we're writing it together. We'll let the cat out of the bag. But I think one of the reasons that we've decided to do that, and we haven't even really talked about the meta reasons, right? There are plenty of reasons to write a book, but I think one of the reasons is that we would like a story to enter the cultural zeitgeist. We think it has a place, and we think it has a story to tell. And so we're like, well, yeah, let's write that and let's put it out there. It's kind of a self-evident thing. That's probably why we haven't talked about it explicitly. But explicitly, that's why anyone creates anything, is they have something to say and they want to say it.
Do you read more nonfiction or fiction?
That's a great question. I used to only read nonfiction, and I didn't read a lot because I hated it. And then eventually I realized, I can actually, not only can I read a lot more books if I allow myself to read the stuff I like, which is fiction, by the way, I can actually get a lot more out of each book that I read, because just like the function that dreams play, or one of the functions that dreams play in our everyday lives, fiction gives us an opportunity to have some wild experiences that would never happen otherwise in a completely safe environment. So these days, oh my gosh, so much fiction. I mean, let's say 50 plus hours of fiction, audiobook format, because that's what I'm able to make time for. Easily 50 hours a month, easily.
Yeah, I had a similar journey. I pretty much only read nonfiction. And I think that's the case for most men. I think statistically, men almost exclusively read nonfiction.
I would agree.
Which I mean, I understand. Like, it's valuable and utilitarian, and obviously valuable, I'll put it that way. And I've definitely read a lot of fiction. And then I kind of bled over to philosophy, which is kind of in between. And then, just a ton of fiction. And I think that the fiction is the most enjoyable, at least on average. Mm-hmm. Sometimes there are things that I've read in nonfiction that have been epiphanies. They've just been so satisfying to read because I've gotten so much out of it. But on average, like, fiction is just an enjoyable experience. And definitely, as you mentioned, put yourself in positions you wouldn't normally be in, and allow you to think of perspectives that you wouldn't normally think of. Because a book is not just words written by a person. Like, it's written with an intent, and not just anybody writes a book. You have to be motivated to write a book. It takes a lot of time. So if you're reading, a full-on novel or a 6-series book, then there is a baked-in purpose, and those, while not quite as obvious as reading a book on finance or on real estate or whatever it may be, it develops you in a very important way. And I wish more people read fiction. Guys, if you're out there, I know you're out there. Dude. Read more fiction. Read more fiction.
Yeah. Read our fiction. Specifically, our book is available summer of 20.
Who knows?
But anytime I meet a guy that I like, that I get, we're vibing. We're speaking the same language, and I learned that they exclusively read nonfiction. I am like, brother, how do I convince this guy that it's actually okay to read fiction? Like, not even, it's beneficial and there's all this other stuff. Like, brother, it's actually totally fine to read fiction. Because I remember when I was a kid, that's all I read, man. And I think I associated that with that era. So I was like, oh, it's juvenile. I am an adult now, so I need to grow up. But like your example of finance, man, you want to read a book on finance, you're going to learn about finance.
Yeah.
And so going into a work of nonfiction is almost always a pretty purposeful move, and it's often successful to that end goal. But that's the nuance that makes not nonfiction, aka fiction, sometimes more powerful, because you don't know what you're going to get out of it until you do. But you so often do, and it's so often meaningful, that I think a lot of people, and a lot of young men especially, are leaving that on the table to their own detriment. And I implore you, just read something that you want to read. And that is the only reason that you're reading it. And I promise you'll get something out of it. I promise. You will be a better person, or whatever you have to convince yourself is the meta reason you're doing it. Just read something you want to read. It's powerful.
Every invention ever made was fiction once, you know? That's a great way to, I think that's the best way to look at it. Everything that anyone has ever invented was fiction once. It didn't exist. Whether it's planes or cars, like, people wrote about these weird things that could roll around and move at speeds that no horse could match. It was fiction back then. Mm-hmm. Going to the moon was fiction. You know, C.S. Lewis and H.P. Lovecraft were writing these weird, crazy things about going to other planets. Well, that was fiction then. You know, we've been to the moon. Yeah. We've been to these places. Like, fiction is just another outlet of creativity and ingenuity. And
every person that's ever lived, their story didn't exist until they did. Their story was a story that hadn't been written yet. They were fictional until they were nonfiction. And a lot of their inspiration for some of the great things they did, I don't know. I do know, actually. I'm not going to couch it. A lot of it came from works of fiction, or works that were fiction until they weren't. I think one of my favorite quotes about science fiction, which is a genre I love, is that science, or rather really, really far future stuff you'd call sci-fi, it's just science fiction that hasn't happened yet. And yeah, science fiction is just the vehicle for the story. The genre really doesn't matter. So I don't care whether it's science fiction, fantasy, some slice of life, anime, right? That's a work of fiction, but it's closer to reality. They all have value. And I think as long as you're consuming some sort of powerful story, you're doing well.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for coming on, Jacob. I think it was a great conversation. I always love our talks. I'm glad, this is the first time we've gotten to record one successfully, at least.
Yeah. We defictionalized our conversation. It's our conversations of somewhat mythic proportions, some might say. So unfortunately, people can see how mythic they are or aren't. But thanks for having me, man. Yeah, I enjoy them too, and I'm glad we got to get one down in the books finally. We've been talking about this for a while, so thanks for having me, man.
Absolutely. It was a pleasure. Thank you for joining me today on Thought Exchange. I hope you enjoyed the episode. If you did, stay tuned for more episodes coming soon. And until next time, keep an open mind.